You're watching Business Access TV.
Business Access.
Business Access.
Business Access.
Business Access.
You are watching Business Access TV.
Business Access TV.
Serious about business.
Serious about business.
It's day 2 of the Development Bank of Jamaica's conference under the theme Delivering Economic Growth Through Partnerships, Private Sector's Participation in Infrastructure Development. As usual, Business Access TV is here to keep you informed. I'm your host, Andrew Laidley, so stay with us. So, Ms. Arana, tell me why the conference was initiated.
Well, the DBJ, as the government's privatization and PPP implementing agency, thought it very important to bring the Jamaican private sector together, potential investors, to understand this business of PPPs a little bit more. We had excellent presenters, global experts in PPPs, and we wanted to share that experience. We also had some very vigorous panel discussions yesterday, and it really imparted a lot of knowledge to the local private sector. One of the most important things as well, and I think we achieved this wonderfully yesterday, was to bring together some key agencies in the government, and they all presented their investment opportunities to the private sector. And the fact that it's regional just added an additional flavor to the conference.
Mr. Reynolds, explain to our viewers what PPP really means.
PPP, public-private partnerships. It's really the government's way of divesting assets that are owned by the state, which the state now believes should be in private hands, and for a number of reasons. In our case, because of the constraints that we have on the fiscal side, the government clearly is not in a position to provide the investments for the expansion of these assets. They would better be served in private hands, who would also be able to manage them more efficiently, more profitably, and importantly, they have the capital to expand these facilities.
What is the DBJ's role in all of this?
Well, as Denise has indicated, the DBJ is the government's agency that handles privatization and PPPs. We do this in a number of ways. We act as the secretariat for the transactions that take place. There are enterprise teams that are established for each transaction. We actually host the enterprise team. We do the secretariat services, and importantly, we provide transaction services for the PPPs and the privatizations as well.
Ms. Arana, tell me a little bit about some of the successful PPPs so far in Jamaica.
Well, I think that, and you would have heard it yesterday, Sangster International Airport is hailed as a Caribbean model for PPPs that has been very successful. You would have heard the President, Audley Diedrich, indicating the amount of government revenues that have come in, taxes, concession fees, the investments that they have made in the airport, and being able to facilitate so many tourists passing through. And it really is a world-class operation. You would know that with the Highway 2000, it has facilitated a reduction in the time linking Kingston to the, Ocho Rios, etc. So I think, and we don't have a lot of economic evidence, which we're looking into to see how we can provide that. But anecdotally, as Jamaicans, we know the difference between driving on the toll road versus probably driving on a secondary road. The Kingston Container Terminal is poised to create again that platform, increasing the capacity of Jamaica to deal with additional traffic, throughput. So we're looking forward to excellent results from that as well. So I think that on a whole, the ones that we have pursued have been very successful.
Caymanas Park as well, which was just recently.
Well, that's a divestment, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So Caymanas Track Limited as well.
PPPs, we do divestments.
Right,
yes.
And divestments as well. So I think that we have been very successful, and it is something that we are pursuing in energy, We're pursuing it with the Water Commission, and so we hope to have more success stories very soon to speak to you about as well.
Of course, the Norman Manley International Airport, which is currently being privatized, is the one that is the current major project that we're working on.
So then the recommendation is that the government divest more and engage the private sector more in these kind of partnerships?
Absolutely correct. And I think that we are here as the DBJ to manage that relationship. And we always like to say balancing the public interest with private sector interest, which is profit. So we can make the best of that situation, obviously, through guidance, policy, excellent project preparation. So we're poised.
And of course, the ultimate objective is that there is a win-win both on the side of the government, who, by divesting the assets, it enables the private sector now to take those assets, make the investments that are needed, make them operate them more efficiently. And as I said, it's a win-win for both the private sector and the government. That's the ultimate objective in all of this.
There, over 1,000 policy makers and industry leaders from 50 countries gathered for dialogue on international infrastructure cooperation. The discussions were all dynamic, but I went away with the striking commentary of Sir Michael Bear, the UK Special Envoy for Sustainable Urbanization to China. He said, "I believe that infrastructure has never been more important to global growth." He noted that global spending on infrastructure projects will double between then and 2025 to reach US $9 trillion per year. Further, he said, overall, close to US 78 trillion is expected to be spent globally between 2014 and 2025. To put that in context, that figure represents more than the total estimated value of the world's infrastructure today. So there is a great need for new infrastructure, which reflects our shifting economic and demographic trends. Bear also said, the key to success in raising enough investment for tomorrow's essential infrastructure rests in finding the optimum balance between public and private money. Further, infrastructure, he said, will need to be investment grade and packaged as genuinely investable opportunities. This is an astounding reality that everyone interested or involved in the business of infrastructural development must keep in full view.
Minister, how important is it that the government engages the private sector in partnerships like this?
Well, what is, because of the tensions that now exist between our governments, particularly in small island development states such as exist in the Caribbean, the tension between our debt, the ratio between our debt to our GDP, we have to find innovative ways to be able to deliver the essential services that are required by our constituencies and the residents in our various communities. And we just cannot afford that upfront cost. And so there is a need to be able to balance public financing with the private financing to be able to put in these necessary infrastructure, because it is a vehicle to economic growth.
And tell me about some of those successful partnerships that you have done in the Bahamas so far.
Well, we have done we redeveloped our major international airport on New Providence, where it is still owned by government. We have put it out to management, and through that management arrangement, the managers have raised the funding, they've guaranteed the repayment, and through the management of the revenue received for the airport, they are paying off the debt. We've seen a significant income stream growth from from about 26 million in 2008 to now 61 million in respect to revenues generated from the aeronautical side. From the commercial side, we're seeing growth from about approximately 1.2 million now to about 5 million per annum. So the proof is there to show that public-private arrangements and partnerships such as that, it augurs well for economic growth in any community. The add-on value to that also is the building of capacity. I mean, the Bahamians are becoming more and more trained, and they now run the airport themselves, even though the Vantage Group is the managing company.
Tell me about some of the PPP ventures in Toronto, Canada.
Right, Andrew. Well, good question. Well, Canada, as you probably know, is the world's number one market for PPPs, has been for the past 2 decades. We've executed probably about 250 projects. So the projects are across all provinces in Canada. And they cover all asset classes: schools, bridges, roads, transit, highways, hospitals, airports. So the government has found that it's the most effective way to deliver infrastructure in the public interest. It delivers strong value for money. And I guess most importantly, from a public standpoint, it moves from deferred maintenance to assured maintenance, meaning that the asset is always in optimum operating condition and it doesn't decay over its lifespan. So the public gets to use good infrastructure and they can depend on it and enjoy it.
And just how important you'd say this is to economic growth in a developing country like Jamaica?
Well, good question. So fundamentally, well-maintained infrastructure underwrites prosperity. It's not just the creation of it, it's to have it well-maintained so that it can endure and support, and its durability supports prosperity. So in particularly in emerging economies where your competitive advantage has to be emphasized, you can pick the infrastructure that supports your competitive advantage and helps you grow. It will underwrite the productivity and effectiveness. So I would say it's an important catalyst to economic growth.
Tell me a little bit about your observation regarding public-private partnership in the region so far.
Well, in the region, public-private partnerships have become an essential modality and tool to get projects going to benefit the communities in the Caribbean. The main problem we have in the Caribbean associated with financing projects is the governments are highly indebted. So if we lend money to governments to do projects, the government don't have the capacity to borrow. So we needed to create another set of vehicles, and those set of vehicles all combined are now becoming joint partnerships with governments and private sector entities, and we call them public-private partnerships. We find those vehicles are just as effective and sometimes even more efficient than governments themselves at delivering goods and services to Caribbean communities.
I see that your base is in Washington, which is in the States. So you do have a bit of knowledge regarding public-private partnerships. What would you say is the formula or the recipe to success?
I would think at the bidding level, where it's decided who would be the private sector entity to get a deal to deliver public services, the key component is transparency. If there's transparency in the process where everybody knows it's a good competition and you're going to get the best price for the money that's being expended, then that's good. You know, going in, the foundation is very important. Now, throughout the deal itself, being able to achieve the goals, being able to measure the goals, being able to show that the beneficiaries actually received what they were supposed to receive from a public-private partnership deal, that is the monitoring and the evaluation side of it that really makes it effective. And then, of course, in a post-evaluation phase, you can understand what becomes a best practice, so you can replicate a deal that you have done in Jamaica in Trinidad, or you can replicate that deal in Barbados, where the socioeconomic circumstances are slightly different, but the metrics of the deal is one that's important and works from one geographical location to the other.
As one of the co-organizers of this conference, my team members and I in the venture capital unit within the DBJ, we're certainly very pleased at the response we've had. We're certainly very pleased at your participation and the feedback that we've gotten for this conference over the last day and a bit. We're also extremely pleased to have welcomed our presenters and participants, not just from locally, but certainly those who have come from afar. Now, you may be wondering, how is the venture capital unit involved in this conference? Venture capital, you tend to think of venture capitalists investing in early stage companies, whereas usually small companies, whereas infrastructure projects tend to be the mega projects. So they're basically on two totally opposite ends of the financial spectrum, the investment spectrum. Now, venture capital really is a subset of the private equity asset class. And private equity investors, and so the venture capitalists are the early stage. The private equity investors, we tend to refer to those as being the ones that are investing at the bigger end of the spectrum. So we've been used to things like buyouts, mergers, and acquisitions, and we look on those as the private equity type transactions. And a lot of those have been commonplace in our markets. What has not been commonplace, however, is investments through funds, particularly private equity funds. Now, at the Venture Capital Unit, we are focused on building the ecosystem for venture capital and private equity in Jamaica. So what that has meant is that we've done a lot of work when it comes to knowledge building, information sharing, and training at workshops and conferences such as these. A key deliverable for our program is having a legal, regulatory, and tax framework that is conducive to the development of the private equity industry. Now, many of you yesterday may have heard a number of speakers speak about the government's fiscal challenges and the fact that the government, through the fiscal discipline, is now pulling back. So there's no room, there's a lot of private capital that is now being unlocked for investment. And investors locally are definitely looking for assets. No, not all investors have the wherewithal to be able to undertake investments in infrastructure on their own. So private equity funds offer the kind of professional management, whether financial management or particular sector expertise, which can facilitate such investments.
Ms. Richards, tell me about some of the linkages between the venture capital project and public-private partnerships.
Well, it would seem a little counterintuitive, wouldn't it, yes, to be thinking of venture capital and infrastructure financing in the same breath. But really, venture capital is a subset of a wider asset class called private equity. And private equity spans from the venture capital, which is investment in the smaller companies, all the way through growth companies and very large companies, and venture and private equity funds also invest in infrastructure in other markets. So this is something that we are looking to promote in Jamaica, because private equity funds, what they bring are professional managers with financial expertise as well as sector-specific expertise. So if you have a private equity fund, for instance, that is an energy fund, the private equity fund managers bring expertise in, say, the energy sector as well as their financial expertise. So investors, institutional investors in particular, which may not have in-house expertise to actually evaluate and undertake these kinds of investments, they can invest through private equity funds, and the fund manager brings that expertise and professional management to the table on their behalf and invests in these infrastructure projects. We have had 2 investments so far, well, several investments in Jamaica, but certainly 2 which have raised capital, 2 fund managers who have raised capital in recent times, one being Portland Private Equity Fund 2 and the other one being Caribbean Mezzanine Fund 1. Both entities have actually raised capital from institutional investors, and some of the investments that they are undertaking are actually in the infrastructure space. Portland in particular has invested in energy projects, not just in Jamaica, but in wind farms across the region and so on. So it is within the private equity space that we have collaborated with the privatization and private partnership division at DBJ in order to host this conference.
Tell me about how important you think private sector partnership really is to economic growth.
It's hugely important to the Caribbean. The Caribbean has been, in global terms, relatively late in coming to public-private partnerships, but that can be a good thing. And Jamaica leads the way. Jamaica has the most private sector investment in infrastructure in the Caribbean. So this conference is trying to spread the lessons of Jamaica's experience and the Caribbean experience in general.
What are some of the benefits to private sector partnership?
Well, the situation our region finds itself in now is that many of our governments, our regional governments, and essentially constituents of the Caribbean Development Bank are financially strapped. There's not sufficient fiscal space to undertake many of the infrastructure initiatives that are necessary to continue along the development trajectory that we would want to see our countries advance along. And so we realize that the private sector is much better poised and much better placed to effectively and efficiently implement a number of these infrastructure interventions. And so it is essential at this point for our board member countries or our governments to partner with the private sector to leverage some of the expertise that is housed within the private sector to move the development agenda forward.
Well, certainly we can't talk about the benefits if we don't talk about some of the risks. So what are some of those? Well,
some of the risks, of course, would be the uptake, I suppose. I mean, with many of the PPPs, and Brian could certainly speak better to this, but with many of the PPPs, the private sector would want a guaranteed uptake, whether it is in terms of water, sanitation, transport, infrastructure. They want to be sure that they're guaranteed off-takers, guaranteed throughput. And that is where our board member countries, the governments of the region, can provide that guarantee to certainly leverage some of that, alleviate some of that risk. Also, in terms of the financing, at the Caribbean Development Bank, we have very concessional resources that could also mitigate some of the risks involved with getting into the early stages of the PPP type arrangements.
I mean, PPPs are good. Let's make no bones about it. But you have to do it the right way. You have to have transparency, you have to have competition, and you have to have fairness in the process. And one thing that we have found in the Caribbean is that sometimes governments do it, but they don't do it in the right way. And that's the message that we're trying to get across. It has to be done. You have to have regulation. It has to be in the right format.
And is there specific agencies or companies that we target with regards to PPP ventures?
Well, we're looking mainly at infrastructure projects, projects that have a good economic impact, that have long-term stable cash flows. These are the kind of projects that are well suited to public-private partnerships. And as Daniel said, the CDB has excellent funds that are available to both governments and the private sector for investment in public-private partnerships.
I'm glad you touched on that. Tell me about, in summary, the CDB's role in assisting public-private partnerships across the region.
Well, for the last 2 years, we've had what we call the RSM, the Regional Support Mechanism for Public-Private Partnerships, which I've been leading. And that really focuses on capacity building, the Caribbean PPP toolkit, and early stage project development. And from that now, we're moving with support from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to form a regional public-private regional PPP unit, which will actually do transaction implementation, help governments to get projects up and running, and also lead into project financing opportunities for CDB and the others, development banks.
Mark Barnett, tell me about the National Water Commission's involvement in PPPs.
Well, interestingly, this is something that we thought is important in terms of how we expand our infrastructure. And so we have been pursuing a number of PPP initiatives. Immediately we were looking at the Raya-Cobre water treatment plant, which we hope to culminate that arrangement by in another 6 months, which would see another 15 million gallons of water moving into Kingston. We're also looking at possible PPP on the North Coast to implement a water treatment plant as well as improving the transmission to complete what we consider a ring main system from Negril all the way to Ocho-Rios. There are other initiatives, including the Soapberry wastewater treatment plant, which we are looking to divest our shareholdings, that is NWC shareholdings, which currently stands at about 85%, to a private entity. We are now doing the business case and the legal review, and so as soon as those are complete, then we'll move into transaction negotiation.
How important is it that the government engages the private sector in public-private partnerships?
Well, you know, it's simple. We, as you know, we are currently restricted under the IMF arrangement, and therefore we can't just sit idle by because of these arrangements. We have to look at innovative ways, and the private sector is just one area that we need to give access to and, you know, encourage them to participate in infrastructure development. So it's very important. In addition, there's a lot of, I want to say, money available in the private sector. There's a pension funds there, you know, interest rate is very low. So long-term investment in infrastructure is the way to go.
That's it from us here. Until next time, I'm your host, Andrew Laidley, and thanks for tuning in to Business Access TV, serious about business.